In this video clip, we're going to talk about the equipment required for pattern cutting, which we have on this side, and garment construction, which we have on this side. Some of the equipment will overlap, but we can discuss that as we go through each piece. So first of all, we'll talk about our pattern cutting equipment. So we have here a pair of shears. These are for cutting our paper patterns out. Now paper blunts the blades, so we need to make sure we use these for paper only, and we have separate shears to do separate processes, as in cutting fabric, for example. So our paper shears, our blade there, you can see, is 14 centimeters. We then require either a pattern master like this. So here we have curves which help when we're drawing on our patterns, necklines and armholes, etc. We have centimeters, if I just turn this over so it's the right way, a few centimeters marked on the edges, increments coming up the sides so we can mark seam allowances and different things easier. And we have a 90-degree and a 45-degree line marked to help us when we're pattern drafting or when we're cutting out bias bindings, etc. Now, we also have a grading square. This does the same job as a pattern master. We have the centimeter increments. We have markings on the side to help with seam allowances. We have a 90-degree and the 45. But we don't have the curve on here like we do on the pattern master. So really it is a personal preference to which you would prefer. You can have both, but really they do the same job, so it's up to you which one you need. Then we need to talk about pencils for drawing and drafting our patterns. Now, when we're doing patterns, accuracy is the key thing. So we want a very fine point and a hard lead. Now, you can either use a propelling pencil or a mechanical pencil or a traditional pencil. But if we're going to use a traditional pencil, we want to be looking at about a 4H, nothing softer. And then of course we will need a nice solid sharpener here to keep that point at the end of the pencil to make sure we're accurate when drafting. We also have our pattern notcher. Now this is not an essential piece of kit to start off with. This is something you can purchase later on, whereas we would need our pattern masters and paper shears and pencils sort of as a starting point. Now a notcher will cut your pattern piece where we have our notches. Instead of marking them with a pencil mark, you can actually snip out a little notch, and then you can do the same on the other pattern piece, making sure the notch is within the seam allowance. We don't want it to go too deep. And then when you're drawing around your pattern pieces, you've got the notches there which will align when you construct. Another piece of equipment we have is an awl. This is these come in different thicknesses, and these are for punching holes. Now we could punch a hole at the bottom of our dart on our pattern piece, so it's easier to transfer that point onto the fabric. Or we can actually use the awl to puncture fabrics as well, If you've got a leather, it's very thick if you're sewing by hand, or just mark details or popper fastenings. It has a lot of applications, but all of which include making a hole with the point. We then have a tracing wheel. Now this year we have a wheel of spikes, and the idea here is that you can trace over your markings on your patterns onto fabric, or you can draw around patterns to trace over. On a personal note, I find them a bit uncontrollable and a bit harsh at the damage these spikes can do, but again, this is personal preference. So this is a tracing wheel. Pop it back in there so we don't catch ourselves on the spikes. We will also need, for our drafting, a tape measure. But a tape measure is an essential piece of kit that you'll use in garment construction as well as pattern drafting. This one has centimeters and inches on the opposite side, and it goes up to 150 centimeters. You would want this as a minimum. You can get some that are longer, but think of this as a minimum. So if we talk about literature to help with pattern cutting, this one here, Winifred Aldridge, this is used mostly within educational faculties. There are many editions. Any edition, is viable. They're all very much the same. The illustrations inside are what has changed. Now, a great thing with the Winifred Aldridge books are the options they give you on each topic. So there are lots of illustrations of different processes within. So you have your pattern drafting of basic shapes and blocks and variations on the styling to help. And because there's so many options here, if you're not sure of a name of something to ask or to do a further search, maybe you can see the options here, and hopefully you'll get the name you're looking for when you want to research any further. Another great book with pattern drafting is this one here. Slightly different layout, less per page. You might find it clearer to understand, but it doesn't have as many options as the Winifred Aldridge book. But they do complement one another, and I would recommend both if you can. But there are many books available on the market, so it's really finding the one that suits you, the one you're happy working with. Another one I have recently purchased, this one here. Again, very clear illustrations. It's presented very well. Again, we have options of different details. I think this sort of sits somewhere between the other two. But I think this is again, a worthwhile textbook if you can afford to get a few. Now, obviously, when we're pattern cutting, another consideration is the fabrics and how they handle when we pattern cut. So this one is by Winifred Aldridge, as was the first pattern cutting book we had. So you can see they would be very similar. They would work well together as complementary texts. It tells us about different fibres and fabrics and how they handle, and then how they fall and drape within the shape of a garment, comparing the differences. So again, a worthwhile textbook if you can sort of build up a library. It is it's a great advantage there to have as a resource. So I'm going to talk now about our equipment for our garment construction. So here we have our fabric shears this time. Again, you can see it's a far more substantial and weightier shears than our paper shears. Again, a nice long blade. I will measure these for you. So with 16cm blade, it means when we are cutting, we have the full length to do a long cut. It's efficient as we're cutting around a garment. This is an essential piece of kit for your garment construction processes. We need a decent pair of shears for when we're cutting the garment out. This one here is what we call a pinking shears. It has a zigzag edge. Now this one isn't used that much, but it sort of just cuts that jagged edge along the edge of the fabric to use maybe to neaten a fabric that wouldn't traditionally fray, but this really is an extravagance as a piece of kit. It's not an essential. Other things we have here are things to mark details on our fabric. So here we have Tailors Chalk in its traditional shape, and it does come in a number of colours. This pen here also is Tailors Chalk. It is a little wheel there, so it's quite accurate to mark, and it has a powder inside instead of the solid chalk. You can also use a pencil. If you've got light coloured fabrics, we can mark, but here we go for a soft lead pencil. So here I would go for at least a 4B in softness. So you're not pressing hard on the fabric. So again, we're creating a fine line to be as accurate as possible. Other things to mark fabric are these pens. The idea of these felt pens here is that they fade away. So you can mark around your pattern piece or maybe a button or buttonhole position, and the idea is that it does fade as it's exposed to the air. If it doesn't fade away, you can use a damp cloth or a wet wipe or something to remove the mark, but that is another option. When we're sewing, you might find you need a stitch unpick if we need to unpick any sewing that we've done for whatever reason. But of course you can also use a Snips or a small pair of scissors. Now again, this is for personal preference. I tend to have my small scissors, my little snips, to cut my thread ends when I'm at my machine. And I also use it to unpick if I need to, rather than a stitch unpick. My small scissors also would replace the need for the snips. But again, these are personal preferences. You can have them all, or you can just have the one. Whatever works for you. But of course, we don't want to be taking our fabric shears to the machine to just trim thread ends. So a smaller tool is beneficial there. We will also need glass-headed pins. Now, it's important with the pins that we have the glass head, so that if we are ironing anything or we have them on the presser bed, that the heat doesn't melt the plastic ends. A nice length of pin also makes it easier to handle. You might find then you will also need some hand sewing needles. So any make, brand, but a variety of lengths and the differences in the eye of the needle, the hole that is there to thread different thicknesses of thread. So that sort of covers equipment then we would need for garment making. Of course, our tape measure, which we had earlier, is necessary here as well. So there's equipment that we find crosses over. Some textbooks maybe that would help and could be interesting for you. This one here on construction has lots of different processes, terminology that you would need to get used to that is specific to sort of machinery and processes. And then there's also another textiles and fashion. These belong to the same set of books. There are a number of these in the series. It's very clear, concise text to work with. Again, here we have fabrics and fibres and how they handle in a garment. So that covers the equipment we would need for our pattern cutting and our garment construction